Emily Dickinson's poem, I Dwell in Possibility, is a poem about poetry. It likens poetry to a house and claims it is a better house to live in than prose. The reasons it gives for this are twofold. On the one hand, it says poetry offers a more private, secluded, and therefore individual and highly personalised space to dwell in than prose. This is what I think it means when it says the house of poetry is superior for doors. On the other hand, it also asserts that once you are inside this house, you are offered a greater variety of perspectives from which to look out at things than you are in prose. This at least is what I think it means when it says the house of poetry is more numerous of windows. And this house of poetry also doubles up, of course, as a house of possibility. These then are the claims the poem makes in relation to its contention that poetry offers a superior dwelling place for readers and writers alike than prose. What evidence, though, does it provide in support of these claims? In terms of what it explicitly says, virtually none. It states, rather than justifies, what it believes. The task of persuading us to assent to what it asserts resides instead, I would argue, in the poem's form, and not least in its use of line and lineation. And this is important to observe, because what this means is that the poem is not simply satisfied with telling us what to believe and hoping we will take its arguments on trust, but rather it wishes us to experience the advantages of dwelling in the house of poetry directly and for ourselves. Let's observe how this works in practice by taking the first stanza on its own. Like the rest of the poem, this stanza is based on a familiar fixed form, the so-called ballad form. Now in the ballad form, lines of 4 beats alternate with lines of 3 beats as follows: da-dum 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 da-dum. Now this pattern, as you can hear, has a very easy flow to it, and it's especially familiar to English speakers, not only from ballads, but also from such things as hymns and nursery rhymes. And from this comes its common associations with joy, childhood, and innocence. Now Dickinson uses this ballad form in many of her poems, including this one. But as is the case here, she frequently breaks up the seemingly easy flow of this form, as well as the perhaps all too easily won sensations of joy, innocence, and childhood that come with it, through her use of her trademark dashes. Now many of these dashes are located at the end of each line, and they thereby prevent one line from rolling all too rhythmically and seamlessly into another. And they force us instead to take up each truncated phrase on its own, turn it around, view it from several different angles, and reflect on how, and whether at all, it relates to the other lines and phrases around it. So in this way, Dickinson's use of dashes at the ends of lines brings very much to the fore the general but sometimes hidden ability of lines in poetry more generally, variously to supplement or even work against the phrase, the clause, or the sentence as a unit of meaning. And in so doing, it draws out additional or even alternative nuances and connotations from individual words and word clusters. In any case, I would argue that in this poem, these dashes function as the doors and windows of the house of poetry, of which the poem expressly speaks. They are doors in the sense that they are off-putting. They shut us out. We can never be entirely sure what we are supposed to make of these dashes, and so long as this remains the case, we may feel that we have never entirely entered or inhabited the poem. At the very least, there is no pre-made key for interpreting or solving them that is readily available to anyone. Instead, each one of us has to find our own way into this house, our own key, and in so doing, we necessarily experience the poem we then enter in a very individual way, as an entirely private and personal space that plays host to a sequence of insights, thoughts and feelings that are unique to each one of us alone. Which is, after all, precisely what the poem says the experience of dwelling in the house of poetry is like. It is in this sense too, then, that these dashes function also as windows. The almost infinite number of ways in which we might interpret them, and along with the transitions they repeatedly mark from one line to the next, constitutes as much an abundance of opportunities as they do an abundance of obstacles. They truly help us experience for ourselves how to dwell in the house of poetry, and how this is also analogous to dwelling in a house of possibility. The house of prose, by contrast, does not use line or lineation as a strategy for generating or enhancing meaning. Instead, because its lines reach consistently from one side of the page to the other, prose is not able to accommodate all the extra doors and windows that poetry opens up on every side of the printed page. This, at any rate, is what I think Dickinson's poem sets out not only to say, but more importantly, to enable to experience and feel for ourselves.